On the 9th day they reach the top. 26,000 men. He stops the column and turns them to face south. Italy is down there somewhere. 218 BC. The Alps. Hannibal leads an army over the highest pass in the ancient world. This is Roman Knights. We go back. We listen. We stay a while. 3 weeks earlier. The road from Gaul smells of pine. Then snow. Then nothing. The first cold. The road from Gaul into the Alps runs uphill before you notice it. This is the first thing the mountain does. It does not announce itself. The ground simply changes. The angle changes. The legs begin to know something the eyes have not confirmed yet. The body is a better geographer than the mind. The army entered in the last days of autumn. October by the Roman calendar. By the calendar of the mountain, it was the season when the passes close. When the stone remembers what cold means. Not the best time. The passes would shut in 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the snow. Hannibal had calculated this. Against the time Scipio would need to reposition in the Po Valley. Against the time Sempronius would need to sail from Sicily. Against the hunger of the Gallic tribes in the north, who were waiting for someone to come down the mountain. Waiting for someone to give their frustration a shape it could use. He had weighed all of this in Cartagena, with maps, with traders' accounts, with reports from men he had sent ahead in September. He had chosen the time anyway. There are decisions that look like mistakes until the first battle is over. Then they look like the only possible choice. He would not know for certain which kind this was for another 60 days. He had made it in August. He would live with it until December. The cold arrived before the snow did. Not cold like Gaul in October. Gaul in October was cold the way wind is cold. Temporary. Something you walk through. This was different. Something that came from above and from inside the stone at the same time. Something that did not wait for nightfall. Something that arrived with the altitude and stayed there. In the clothing. In the joints. In the particular ache that settles into a man's hands. When the temperature drops past a certain point and does not rise again for several days. The men from Africa felt it first. Numidia has altitude. In the interior east of Sirte, December nights are cold. The Numidian soldiers knew cold. They did not know this cold. The Alps in October are more thorough than any cold they had named before. It works downward into the body from multiple directions. From the air above. From the stone below. From the shadow the peaks throw across the path. The shadow that arrives in the morning and does not lift until midday. That lifts for 2 hours. That returns before it has finished what it started. By the second day, the Numidian cavalry had begun to wrap their hands. Cloth cut from the lower edges of their cloaks. The cloaks were thinner for it. The cold found the new gaps quickly. The men from Spain had seen mountains before. The Pyrenees. They knew the cold of altitude. The Pyrenees in August were different from the Alps in October, though. The Iberians looked at the Africans and said nothing. Saying nothing was their particular form of sympathy. The men from Gaul had grown up in the shadow of these peaks. They knew what 4,000 feet felt like in late October. They walked without changing pace. This was its own kind of message. The column had been moving since before dawn. 50,000 men and animals, stretched along a road not always wide enough for 4 men abreast. The front could not see the rear. The rear could not hear the front. Between them, the particular sound of an army through stone. The rhythm of boots on rock. The creak of harness. The complaint from a mule that had decided its load was unreasonable. Sound bouncing off valley walls. Arriving from unexpected directions. Sound is strange in mountains. On flat ground, sound comes from where it comes from. In mountains, sound comes from where the walls decide to send it. A voice can arrive from behind you when the speaker is ahead. An army marching through a narrow valley hears itself differently. It hears itself larger than it is. On the first day, this was reassuring. The elephants did not like the cold. They communicated this without ambiguity. The handlers had learned to read their complaints. A trunk held horizontally, moving in slow arcs, general displeasure with conditions. A low sound made with the mouth closed, moving through the chest. The disagree sound. It meant nothing was wrong specifically. It meant everything was wrong. In the way that everything is wrong when you are large and the world has become very cold. The elephants had been making the disagree sound since the first morning. The handlers had developed a response. One hand on the flank. Held still. Not rubbing. Still. An elephant distinguishes between touching that moves and touching that is simply present. Moving touch is assessment. Still touch is company. The handlers held still. The elephants kept moving. This was the arrangement. There were 37 of them. Hannibal had brought them from Cartagena because the accounts said they could change a battle. He had taken them through the Pyrenees. Leaving them behind would have cost him the appearance of a complete army. He had brought them across the Rhone on platforms because it was impossible. Impossible things are more useful than possible ones when they succeed. He had taken them into the Alps because there was no other way. The road between the Rhone and Italy goes over the Alps. There is no road that goes around. He had known this since planning the crossing in spring. The Alps were not a problem to be solved. They were a condition to be managed. He managed conditions the way he managed campaigns, by walking every part of them before asking anyone else to walk the same ground. He had been in the Alps twice before this crossing. Small parties. Learning the ground before the ground had anything to teach that he did not want to know yet. He had walked sections of 3 passes with a guide in summer. Summer was not October, but summer gave him the shape of the thing, and shape was what he needed. The shape, 9 days up, 6 days down. In the middle, a summit with a view of Italy. Everything else was context. He had built the context into the plan. On the first day, the road was wide enough for the column to move at its natural pace. The men who had been moving well since the Rhone moved well here. The men who had been slow in Gaul were slow here. The mountain had not yet required anything the column was not already giving. That would change. He walked at his position 2/3 back from the front. Not tactical. This was the position that let him see the most of the column at once. Close enough to the front to reach it quickly. Far enough back to see the middle sections, where problems most often developed and least often announced themselves. He looked at the column. He counted as he always counted. Not individual men. Sections. The Numidian cavalry had lost 2 mounts to lameness since the Rhone. He had absorbed this into the calculation. The African infantry section near the middle was carrying more equipment than he would have preferred. He had noted this the previous day and said nothing. The officers would adjust on the march. He looked at the mountain. The road was cut into the side of the valley. To the left, the slope fell away into a gorge where a river ran far below. The sound of it rising in thin air. To the right, the mountain went up. The kind of steep that a man could climb with hands and feet if the rocks were solid. The rocks here were solid. Above the steep section, the ridge. He had been looking at the ridge since the army entered the valley. Not with urgency, with attention. There is a difference. Urgency narrows the field of view. Attention opens it. He had been looking at the ridge the way he looked at anything that might become relevant. Completely, without conclusion, storing information for when it was needed. The ridge was empty. That was the correct condition. Empty ridges were good ridges. Full ridges were problems. He had not expected the ridge to be full on the first day. He had expected it on the third. The first night's camp was at the widest section of the valley floor. The engineers had walked ahead for 3 hours to find it. Wide was relative in a mountain valley. Wide enough for half the army to sleep horizontally. The other half slept on the slope with their backs against the uphill side. Not comfortable. Less uncomfortable than the alternative. Hannibal ate what the camp provided. Grain and dried meat and what the last Gallic settlement had contributed before the mountains began. The contributions had stopped at the edge of the mountains. Mountain communities have limited stores and a strong sense of what belongs to whom. He ate without speaking to his officers. They ate without speaking to him. This was the arrangement after a day's march. The evening was for eating, then for the information he needed. The information that shaped the decisions of the next day. The scouts came after dark. 2 Numidians who had gone ahead on the road. 2 Iberian light infantry who had gone up the slope to the right. All 4 came at the same time, which meant they had compared notes before coming back. Which meant there were things to compare. He listened. The road was passable for 4 more days, the Numidian said. After that, a section where rockfall had narrowed it. The width of 1 man in places. Passable. Slowly. He noted the rockfall section. He would come back to it. The Iberian who had gone up the slope. A village on the far side of the ridge. Small. 100 or 200 people. The Allobroges. They had been on the ridge that afternoon. Gone by the time he arrived at the top. He said, where would they have gone? Back to the village, the Iberian said. For the evening meal. That was what people from such villages did. He said, in the morning? Back to the ridge, the Iberian said. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the map he had made in his head that afternoon. The ridge above the valley. The position of the village behind it. The route a man would take from the village to the ridge in the morning. The time it would take. He said, how many were on the ridge this afternoon? 8 visible. Perhaps 12. The Iberian had not seen all of the ridge. He thanked the scouts and sent them to their sections. He sat at the edge of the camp and thought about the ridge. Not for long. He had learned, in 15 years of campaign, that the thinking that mattered happened quickly. The first thought was usually the right thought. Extended thinking refined it. Extended thinking past a certain point introduced doubt where doubt was not useful. The first thought, they will come to the ridge in the morning. They will watch the column. They will make a decision based on what they see. The second thought, what they see will determine what they decide. The third thought, from the first 2, he could control what they saw. He went to sleep. The second day began as the first had. Before dawn. Before the camp was fully moving. The particular sounds of an army waking in a cold place. Cold muscles. The creak of equipment on bodies that had not yet recovered from the day before. The cold was sharper on the second morning. Not dramatically. The kind of sharper that a man who has slept cold and woken cold notices in the first breath. The lungs know before the mind does. The first breath of morning air tells the body what the night has done. The body adjusted. This is what bodies do. They adjust. They do not enjoy the adjustment while it is happening. The adjustment is available regardless. The column moved. The road narrowed in the first hour. Not sharply. Over the course of a mile. The valley walls moved closer. The path between them became less a road and more a suggestion. The gorge on the left deepened. Looking left. The sound of water moving fast over rock, far below. The particular insistence of a river in the bottom of a narrow gorge. Continuous. Indifferent. It had been making this sound long before there was an army to hear it. The men near the left edge of the path looked at the gorge. Then looked at the path ahead. This is the correct response. Looking at the gorge is not useful while you are walking beside it. The baggage section moved in the middle. An army on a mountain road divides naturally into three parts. Fighting units at the front. Fighting units at the rear. Baggage in the middle, moving at the pace of the slowest mule on the worst section of road. The column moved at the pace of the baggage. On the second day, the baggage moved well enough. On the third day, it would not. He was thinking about the third day. He walked and thought about the ridge, about the village behind it, about the 12 men who had not been fully seen. He did not look at the ridge. Looking at the ridge would tell the men near him to look at the ridge. What the column looked at became what the column thought about. He wanted the column thinking about the road. He was thinking about the ridge for them. He had a specific question. Not, will the Allobroges attack? That answered itself. Of course they would consider it. An army with 3 months of supplies and 37 elephants was not something to simply watch pass. They would consider everything available to them. The road, the baggage, what could be brought down onto a column that had nowhere to go beside a gorge. The question was not whether. The question was where. Where was answerable. He had walked this road or one like it twice before. He knew the sections where the path was widest, the sections where it was narrowest, the places where the ridge came close above, the places where it retreated. He knew which sections offered footing for men above and which were too steep for anything except falling. The where pointed to one section, 3 miles ahead, where the valley bent left and the road followed the bend and the ridge came down close above the path, where a man on the ridge could see directly onto the path below, where a man on the ridge could put a stone onto the path below with moderate effort. He was thinking about the third day because the section was 3 miles ahead. The column moved at 2 miles per hour in mountain terrain. The third day would bring them to that section in the morning. The baggage would be in the middle of it. The Allobroges were also counting miles. He could not know this for certain. He treated it as certain because it was the intelligent thing to do. They had been managing this mountain and its passes for generations. They knew the road. They knew the sections. They knew where an army was vulnerable. He would not let them use what they knew. He called his guide, a Gaul from the lower foothills east of the Rhone, through the Allobroges territory many times. He knew them the way people in adjacent territories know each other. Imperfectly, accurately enough. He asked one question. He asked it twice in 2 different ways to confirm the answer was the same both times. Where do the Allobroges sleep at night? The village, on the far side of the ridge. Below the ridge in the valley behind. They climbed to the ridge in the morning. They came down in the evening. How early in the morning? After first light, the guide said. He thanked the guide and sent him back to his position. He kept walking. He thought without it appearing on his face. A skill that takes time to develop. He walked and counted the things on the left side of the road. Trees, rocks at the edge of the gorge, an exposed root where the path had eroded, a flat stone that might have been placed deliberately or might be where gravity had decided. He counted to occupy the part of his mind that was not thinking. The counting kept that part busy. The thinking continued in the other part. That evening he called his best infantry commander. He spoke to him for 15 minutes. Quietly, he drew the ridge in the dust with a stick. The position of the village behind it, which he had not seen but had calculated from what the guide said. The path from the village to the ridge in the morning. The time it would take. He drew the position he wanted the infantry in when the village people arrived at the ridge. The commander looked at the drawing. He said, "How many?" Hannibal said, 2,000. The most reliable section from the Iberian infantry. The ones who have been in mountains before. He said, "How early?" Hannibal said, "They move at the 3rd hour before dawn. The south route up the slope. No main path. No torches. He said, "The south route." Hannibal said, "I will show you before they move. Come to me at the 4th hour before dawn." The commander went back to his section. Hannibal ate what was available, and he ate enough, and he did not think about eating while he was eating. He thought about the ridge. He thought about the south slope of the ridge as he had seen it that afternoon. The angle of it, the rocks, the places where a man could put his feet without announcing them. He had been looking at the south slope all afternoon. Not with focus, with attention that does not disturb what it is looking at. Anyone watching him would have seen a general looking at the road ahead. He had been looking at the south slope. He went to sleep early. He slept 3 hours. He had learned this about himself when he was 20 and in his first campaign in Spain. 3 hours restores most of what a full day uses. 2 hours leaves a man functional but not at his best. Below 2 hours is not advisable before a significant decision. The third day was not a battle, but what happened on the third day would determine whether the fourth day became one. The third day was a decision. He slept 3 hours and woke in the dark and lay still for a moment. He counts, in that first moment of wakefulness, the things he knows. Not reviews. Counts. 1. The ridge is 3 miles ahead. 2. The Allobroges are in the village behind it. 3. They will be on the ridge after first light. 4. His infantry will be on the ridge before that. 5. The baggage section is vulnerable. 6. It will pass the exposed section on the third day. 7. He has done what he can do. 8. The rest will happen as it happens. He got up. He dressed in the dark. He took his sword. He told the guard he was going to look at the ground. He went to find the infantry commander. There were more Allobroges on the ridge the next morning than there had been the day before. He had expected this. A group watching a large army pass always grows. The watchers tell the village what they have seen. The village sends more watchers. By the third morning, the ridge would have twice the men it had on the first afternoon. Twice the men on the ridge. All of them watching the road below. None of them expecting to find anyone already on the ridge when they arrived. He found the infantry commander at the horse lines. The man was awake and dressed. He had not slept. Hannibal noted this without comment. Some men sleep before a decision. Some men do not. The quality of the decision is not reliably related to the sleep. He showed the commander the south route in the dark. A slope steep enough to be difficult and not so steep as to be impossible. The rocks were solid. He had tested them that afternoon with one hand, pressing against each outcrop as he passed. The route went up for 300 feet before reaching the ridge. At night, without torches, it would take an hour. He said, 2 hours before the first light. Start the men at 3 hours. 1 hour to climb, 1 hour in position before the Allobroges arrive. The commander said, if they arrive earlier. Hannibal said, they will not. He said this because he had asked the guide twice and the guide's answer was the same both times. After first light, a village that climbs to a ridge every morning knows when it climbs. The habit is the answer. He left the commander to prepare his men. He went back to his tent. He lay down and counted backward from 1,000. He was asleep before 800. Outside, the mountain did what mountains do at night. It made no sound it had not been making for 10,000 years. The cold moved through the camp. The guards moved slowly. Their breath was visible in the torchlight where torches were permitted. The animals shifted in their sleep. The river in the gorge ran where it had always run, indifferent to the army on the path above it. 2 hours before dawn, the Iberian infantry began to move. 2,000 men in the dark, on a slope that required hands in places. No torches. No sound that could be avoided. The The sound that could not be avoided, boot leather on rock. Breath in cold air. The small adjustments a man makes when the footing is uncertain. Trusting his body to manage what his eyes cannot see. They went up. The column below was still sleeping when they reached the ridge. They held the position in the dark, without being told to be silent. Silence on a ridge before dawn is the obvious response. The enemy sleeping below. The enemy's enemy expected from behind the peak to the north. They found it without instruction. Hannibal had not gone up with them. He was at the front of the column, dressed and ready, watching the ridge from below in the last dark before the light changed. He had given the infantry commander the orders. He had given the ridge the position. The ridge would handle what followed. This was the part of command that did not improve with involvement. The plan was made. The men were placed. Arriving in person to oversee the execution of a plan already understood would add noise and subtract certainty. He watched the ridge. He counts on the left side of any path. He has done this since he was a child in his father's camp in Spain. His father counted the names of men. Hannibal counts objects, trees, rocks, the particular features of ground that might matter later. He does not always know which features will matter. He counts them all. The ones that matter will identify themselves in time. 5 trees on the left side of the road below the ridge. 4 outcrops of rock visible in the early light. 1 section of path that bent slightly inward toward the cliff face. 1 place where the path was wide enough for 2 men and then narrowed again. The light changed, not the sun. The change before the sun. The gray that comes before the color does. The gray that makes shapes visible without making them clear. He looked at the ridge. Then, on the far side of the ridge, sound. Movement. The particular sound of men coming up a slope they have come up before. The sound of a path that is known. Easy confidence in the feet. The Allobroges were coming. He did not move. He did not give any order. He watched the ridge and counted the men who appeared at the top. 14. Then 3 more. Then 5 more. 22 men on the ridge at first light. More than 12. More than the 8 the Iberian scout had counted 2 days before. They reached the top of the ridge. They stopped. His infantry was already there. 2 before dawn. He woke 2 hours before dawn. He did this without being woken. He had slept the 3 hours he calculated he needed. Not more. The body, when properly managed, is an instrument. An instrument does not oversleep. He dressed. He took his sword. He told the guard he was going to look at the ground. Tell no one. Then he climbed. Not toward the Allobroges' fires. Away from them. To the south, where the ridge ran lower and the slope was less difficult. He went up in the dark with no torch. Slowly. He tested each foothold before he put his weight on it. He was not in a hurry. He was in the dark on a mountain, and hurry was not useful. It took an hour to reach the ridge. He has done this before every significant obstacle since Spain. Not always on foot. Sometimes on horseback. Sometimes in a boat, moving along a riverbank before the army arrived. Before the Rhone crossing, he had spent 2 hours on the bank in the dark. Before the Pyrenees, he had ridden to the high point at night and looked at the range from above. Before each thing he has had to move an army through, he has gone first. Not bravery, not sentiment, calculation. A general who has been in the dark before his army arrives there knows the dark. He knows where the ground is reliable and where it is not. He knows which sounds are the mountain and which sounds are something the mountain is hiding. He knows what the place feels like before the army changes it. An army changes everything it enters. The sounds change. The smells change. The geometry of the place rearranges itself around the presence of 50,000 people. After the army arrives, the place is not the same place it was before. He needed to know the place before the army arrived. He climbed the south slope in the dark. The slope was steep but not precipitous. The kind of steep that requires attention without requiring technical skill. A man with good feet and no fear of dark and no fear of height could climb it. He had good feet. He had been climbing slopes like this since his father took him on campaign at the age of 9. Since the years in the Spanish mountains before the Ebro. His father had died in a river, not a mountain. He does not think about this on slopes. He thinks about it at rivers. He understood this for the first time at 9 years old. There are places that kill people. Some people go to those places anyway, because the places contain something necessary. This is the arrangement he has maintained since then. His father went to the river because the river contained something necessary. He went to the south slope of this ridge at 2 hours before dawn for the same reason. The footing was loose in places. Frost over loose stone. He moved through these sections slowly. Full sole of the foot, not the ball. The ball of the foot is for speed. The full sole is for uncertain ground. He had learned this in Spain at 14. From a soldier who had climbed mountains in Africa before he was conscripted. The soldier was dead now. The knowledge was not. He went up. The cold was thorough at 2 hours before dawn on the 4th day in the Alps. Not the cold of the lower slopes. Something more specific. The cold that arrives after midnight and before the first light. When the air temperature has dropped to its lowest point. When the stone has radiated the last of what the sun gave it the previous day. The cold of the mathematical bottom of the night. He felt it in the hands first. He always felt cold in the hands first. He has thin hands. Not weak. Thin. The cold finds thin hands before it finds other things. He kept moving. Movement is the second answer to cold. The first answer is fire. He did not have fire. He had movement. He climbed. At 300 feet up the slope, the ridge began to shape itself against the sky. In the dark, the ridge appears not as a line but as a change in the quality of darkness. The darkness of the sky is different from the darkness of stone. The sky has faint light in it even when there is no moon. The stone has none. Where the stone ends and the sky begins, the darkness changes. He had been watching for this change since the first 100 feet. He reached the ridge. From the ridge, in the dark, he could see the fires on the northern section of the ridge. Not close, perhaps half a mile along the ridge line, where the ridge curved north. 7 fires. 7 fires for how many men was a question the dark could not answer. He had his estimate from the guide. Perhaps 40 in the village who would come to the ridge. Perhaps fewer at night, and the others would arrive in the morning. He did not speculate beyond what he could calculate. 7 fires meant men who planned to be on the ridge at least through the night. Men who planned to be on the ridge for the morning. He looked at the fires and counted them, and the counting confirmed what he already knew. 7 fires was the same number as the previous evening's count, made from below. The fires had not grown in the night. They had not shrunk. They were the fires of a group that had a plan and was executing it. He turned from the fires and looked at the ridge itself. The ridge ran from north to south. He was on the southern section. The northern section had the fires. Between his position and the fires, the ridge was empty. He could not see this clearly in the dark. He could feel it. The silence of empty ground in the dark is different from the silence of occupied ground in the dark. Occupied ground breathes. Empty ground does not. He looked at the path below, visible as a slightly lighter line against the darker ground of the slope. He looked at where the path went narrow and where it went less narrow. He looked at the distance from the ridge to the path. He counted the sections of the path that were most exposed. Where a man on the ridge could reach the path below, and how fast and from which direction. He looked at all of this for 30 minutes. A long time to stand in the dark on a ridge in October at 2 hours before dawn. He was not cold while he was looking. He noticed this. When the mind is fully engaged, the body holds what it needs. It does not spend what it does not have to. He had found this useful over the years. The plan was correct. He had thought it was correct from the camp. He had thought it was correct when he had given the orders to the infantry commander. He thought it was correct now, with the actual ground under his feet, the actual fires visible in the actual dark. The plan was correct. The ground confirmed it. He went back down. The descent was faster than the ascent. The frost over loose stone was more dangerous going down than going up. He went slowly anyway, testing each foothold. A general who breaks an ankle 2 days before the critical section has made a specific kind of mistake. The kind that cannot be recovered from in time. He went slowly. At the bottom, he looked at the south slope from below. He looked at it the way he looks at anything he has been inside. From below, the south slope looked different from above and different again from the side, and the difference mattered. The infantry going up would see what he saw now. They would find the footing he had tested. They would climb in the dark without torches. They would reach the ridge. He went back to the camp. He woke the infantry commander. The man was already half awake. He had been lying on his side in the dark with his eyes open. Hannibal had seen this before in men before significant actions. Some men cannot sleep through the last night. Their bodies are already preparing for what the next morning requires. He told him, "The south route is clear. I walked it. The footing is solid where the frost is not. Where the frost is, go full soul. The ridge is 2,000 feet above the camp. 1 hour if the men move well." The infantry commander repeated this. He said, "I walked it." He did not say, "I know because I was told." He said what was true. He had walked it. The infantry commander said, "I will have the men ready at the 3rd hour before dawn." He nodded. He went to his tent and lay down. He counted backward from 1,000. The count is not for sleep. The count holds the mind in a specific place, so that the other part of the mind can complete its work. The part that has already decided everything that can be decided, without interference. At 842 he was asleep. At the 3rd hour before dawn, the infantry began to move. He was not with them. He was at the front of the column, where the column would begin its own movement when the moment was right. The infantry commander had the orders. The men had the instructions. The south slope had the footing he had tested. The ridge had the empty space that was available to the first people who arrived there. He would not verify what he had already verified. He stood at the front of the column and watched the sky. The sky before dawn changes in a specific order. The change is not dramatic. It is the opposite of dramatic. It is so gradual that looking at any given moment, nothing appears to have changed. Only in comparison does the change become visible. First, the quality of the darkness, less absolute, not lighter, less absolute. Then, at the horizon above the peaks, the beginning of something, not yet light, the direction light is coming from. Then the shapes, not clear, present. He watched the sky. He counts on the left side of any path. There was no path in front of him. He was standing at the front of the column facing a ridge, looking at the sky. He counted stars. Not all of them. The ones in the section of sky directly above the ridge. 14 stars in that section. Then 13. One cloud, moving from the west. Then 12. He watched the ridge. The infantry had been moving for 2 hours. The sky began to show the first of what he had been waiting for. Not light. The change before the light. The gray. He looked at the ridge. The ridge was still dark. But against the lighter sky, the shape of the ridge was visible. The line of it, running north-south. The southern part, occupied by his infantry. The northern part, occupied by the Allobroge's fires. Between them, the empty section. He watched. At the ridge, in the dark, just before the gray, 2,000 Iberian infantry were on the ground. Not standing. On the ground. They had been trained in Spain to move on the ground when the ground was better cover than standing. The ground was better cover than standing when the enemy was expected from above. Expected from above because the enemy was coming over the ridge from the other side. They were on the ground. He had given this instruction to the infantry commander. He had given it based on what he had seen from the ridge the previous night. The Allobroges would come over the top of the ridge from the northern path. They would see the ridge in front of them. If his infantry were standing, the Allobroges would see them from a distance. They would have time to make a decision. If his infantry were on the ground, the Allobroges would not see them. Not until they were already on the same section of the ridge, at which point the decision would already be made. He had given this instruction to the infantry commander. He did not know if the infantry commander had followed it. He had been on the south slope for an hour in the dark. He had not seen the infantry from above. He trusted the instruction had been followed. The infantry commander had repeated it back correctly. This was the kind of instruction that, once given to a capable officer, does not require supervision. He would know in a few minutes whether the trust was correct. He watched the ridge, the gray. On the far side of the ridge, he could hear it before he could see it. Movement. The particular sound of men coming up a slope they have come up before. The sound of a path that is known. Not careful the way his infantry had been careful on the south slope. Confident. The confidence of men who know where they are going and expect to find it the way they left it. The Allobroges were coming. He did not move. He gave no order. He stood at the front of the column. He watched the ridge. He counted the men who appeared at the top. The first man appeared at the top of the ridge and stopped. Hannibal could not see his face from this distance. He could see the shape of him. A man who has stopped because what he sees is not what he expected to see. The shape of a man who expected an empty ridge and has arrived at an occupied one. 14. Then 3 more. Then 5 more. 22 men on the ridge at first light. They came over the top and stopped one by one, each one seeing what the one before had seen. The stopping spread along the line of them as the information traveled from the front to the back. 22 men on a ridge who expected to look down at an army, instead looking at 2,000 Iberian infantry, in the gray of the morning before the sun came over the peaks. The moment lasted, not long, perhaps 20 seconds. 20 seconds in which both sides understood the situation from different sides of the same piece of ground. The Allobroges understood that the position they had planned to use was no longer available to them. His infantry understood that the men they were supposed to replace had arrived, and found them there instead. Nothing was said in those 20 seconds. He could not have heard it from below if something had been said. Some of them threw things. Rocks. One javelin that he could see from below, arcing out and falling short of the infantry position. The throw of a man who is demonstrating frustration rather than attempting a result. Noise was made. Then they began to move back. Not quickly. Not the retreat of a routed force, which is a different kind of movement. The careful movement of men reconsidering their options. With the dignity of people used to controlling a mountain, who are not currently controlling a mountain. They withdrew to the northern section. His infantry held the southern section. The passage below belonged to the column. He allowed himself to acknowledge this for 3 seconds. Not longer. 3 seconds was the appropriate duration for the acknowledgement of a plan executed correctly. After 3 seconds, the plan had been executed correctly in the past and the present required attention. The baggage section was 2 hours behind the front of the column. The Allobroges had retreated from the southern ridge to the northern ridge. The northern ridge was above the section of path the baggage section would use in approximately 2 hours. The plan had worked on the ridge. The plan was not yet complete. He turned to his officers. He said, "Move the column. Close the intervals. The Numidian cavalry to the south of the baggage section." He said, "I want the baggage through the exposed section before the 3rd hour." He said, "Send 300 of the Iberian cavalry to position on the left of the ridge path. Not fighting position, presence position." His officers repeated these orders back to him. He said, "Move." The column moved. The morning had come. Not fully. The gray was becoming something with more color in it. The peaks above the ridge caught the first light before the valley did. The peaks went from gray to a specific color of gold. No name for it in any language he knew. He had seen it in Spain and in Africa. It meant the day was beginning, regardless of what the day was going to contain. The day was beginning. He moved with the column. The baggage section would pass the exposed section in 2 hours. The Allobroges had not fully withdrawn. They had withdrawn from the southern ridge. The northern ridge was still theirs. The northern ridge was above the exposed section of the path. The baggage section would be vulnerable for perhaps 90 minutes as it moved through that section. He had moved fighting units into the baggage section before dawn. He had sent cavalry to the left of the ridge path. He had the southern ridge occupied by his own infantry. What he could not do: move the Allobroges off the northern ridge without a fight. A fight that would cost more than it was worth. The northern ridge was theirs by position and by knowledge of the terrain. Taking it would cost time and men. It would announce the attempt before it was complete. He had calculated this the previous evening. The baggage needed to move fast. He had done what he could do to make the exposed section survivable. He had not solved the exposed section. Solving it would have required removing the Allobroges from the northern ridge, which he had decided not to do. He had decided to make the exposure brief and the protection sufficient. Brief meant fast. The baggage had to move fast. He went to the baggage section. He told the section leader, "Full pace. No intervals between animals. Close everything. If a mule stops, leave it. Move." The section leader looked at him. He said, "Full pace. I will be here." The section leader gave the order. The baggage section moved. He was in the middle of it when the Allobroges came off the northern ridge. 3. Italy. On the 9th day they reached the top. Not by plan. By the simple fact that the ground stopped going up. The path leveled for the first time since the army had entered the mountains. The men at the front stopped because the ground stopped. The men behind stopped because the men ahead had stopped. The stopping moved back through the column in a slow wave, like the stop of all things that have been moving for a long time, that have arrived at the place they were moving toward. The summit was a wide, flat space between the high peaks. Snow on all the flat surfaces. Wind that had been there longer than anyone present. The sky was lower here or seemed lower. The clouds moved differently. The air had a thinness to it that the air below had been building toward for 9 days. The army assembled on the summit without being told to assemble. They simply stopped and stood together in the cold. No formation, no order by section. They stood the way people stand when they have arrived at a place they were not certain they would reach. He had been certain. They had not been. He walked to the southern edge of the flat ground, where the mountain began to drop, and he looked. On clear days from the summit of this pass you can see the Pa Valley. Not close, not as a destination you could walk to in an afternoon, but visible. Flat ground, Far below, the color of flat ground, different from the color of mountain. The line where the mountains ended and the plain began. Italy. The word was not useful here. The word was something men said when they were far from the thing. This was not far from the thing. This was the thing itself, visible below, waiting. A different color from the mountain. Flat where the mountain was not flat. Real in the specific way that things are real when you have been moving toward them long enough. Long enough that they have become a kind of faith. Now it was not faith. Now it was visible. He stood there for a while. He felt the cold wind off the peaks above. He felt the thin air of altitude doing what thin air does, making every breath a minor effort, making the body aware of itself as a system that breathes. He stood. He looked at Italy. Then he turned and walked back to the army. He told his officers to bring the men to the edge. They came. They came in sections by the natural groupings of men who have marched together for a long time. The Iberian infantry came first because they had been at the front of the column on the final approach. The Numidians came next, their horses coming with them. The Numidians do not separate themselves from their horses in new places. The African infantry came after. The Gallic recruits who had joined at the Rhone came last. The ones who had been in these mountains before, who had said nothing about whether they expected to survive the crossing. They stood at the southern edge of the summit. They looked. No one spoke for a while. This was the silence of men who understood that what they saw required a moment. Words would come later. Words are a later thing. The first thing, when you see something you have been moving toward, is not words. It is the adjustment the body makes. When the thing it has been orienting toward is no longer ahead of it. They were looking at Italy. Some of them had not believed it was actually on the other side until this moment. They had believed it the way men believe things they have been told. They had been told by Hannibal since the Pyrenees. There was something on the other side of the mountain. Something worth the Pyrenees. Worth the Rhone. Worth 9 days of this. Now they believed it the way men believe things they can see. Hannibal looked at their faces. He has been looking at men's faces since he was 9 years old in his father's camp in Africa. His father taught him this. Not explicitly, by doing it, by walking the line every morning. Looking at the men's faces before he asked about their feet or their equipment. The face is the last thing a man controls when he is close to his limit. The face gives up its information before the man knows he is giving it. He had been watching his army's faces since the Pyrenees. On the Pyrenees, faces that were uncertain. They had been asked to follow him to a mountain range they had not crossed. They went because he went, because his father's name was still currency in certain parts of Spain, because the pay was adequate and the alternative was less certain. On the Rhone, faces that had adapted. They had crossed the Pyrenees. The Pyrenees were done. The Rhone was the new problem, and the faces had already begun the negotiation with the new problem. On the Alps, days 1 through 4, faces that were inside the mountain. Focused, present, the specific expression of men who are managing moment by moment and are not available for anything beyond the moment. Now, on the summit, looking at Italy, faces he had not seen in a long time. He had not seen, on this campaign, the face that appears when a man believes in what he is doing. Believed in it before. The belief had been an abstraction, plan, a route, a reason. Now it was visible. He said nothing. He let them look. They would fight better for this. Not because looking at Italy made them brave. Men are not made brave by looking at distant things. They fight better because the thing is now real. A man fights for an abstraction differently from how he fights for something he has stood at the edge of a mountain and seen. He had planned for this moment in Cartagena. He had planned for it in terms of time and logistics. 2 days rest on the summit. Let the men look as long as they needed. Let the animals recover. Let the injured be treated properly. Let the body have the 2 days it needed before the descent. He had not planned for what it felt like to be the man who had brought them here. He had been on campaigns since he was 9. He had commanded since he was 25. He had moved armies through difficult terrain before. Spain, parts of Africa, the eastern sections of the Iberian coast, where the mountains come down to the water and the road is a narrow shelf above the sea. He had not moved an army through the Alps before. He stood at the edge of the summit and looked at Italy, the same thing his army was looking at. The distance between what he had planned for in Cartagena and what was visible now was small. He allowed himself to note this for the same 5 seconds he had allowed himself on the 4th day. Then he gave the orders. 2 days rest here. Stragglers to be collected. Equipment checked. The injured counted and assessed and treated with what remained of the medical supplies. The animals checked. The engineers to assess the rope situation. He wanted a full accounting of what remained before the descent began. He had lost things on the way up. He needed to know exactly what remained before he went down. The descent was harder than the ascent in specific ways. The specific ways required specific things. He needed to know if he had those things. 2 days on the summit. The army spent them in the cold. The snow fell on the 1st day. Light. Enough to cover the flat surfaces again after the men had disturbed them. The animals stood in the snow and were unhappy in their usual ways. The handlers were with them. The men who could not stand ate lying down. The physicians moved through the camp with what they had. The surgeons had been busy since the 1st day in the mountains. Frostbite, cuts from the rock. 2 men with broken bones from falls that had not been fatal. 3 men with a cold weather sickness that the African physicians recognized and the Iberian physicians did not. The Africans treated it with what they had. Not what they would have used in Africa. Sufficient. On the 2nd day, the sky was clear. From the summit on a clear day, the view extended further than it had on the day of arrival. He could see the Valley with more detail. Not close, but more detail. The brown of the dry autumn fields. The darker lines where water ran. The faint color of settlements, small from this distance. He stood at the edge again on the 2nd day. He stood there for a longer time than he had on the 1st. He is not a man who looks at things he has already seen. He does not revisit finished things. He had been at the southern edge of the summit on the day of arrival. He had looked as long as was necessary. He had turned back to the army. He was at the edge again on the 2nd day for a different reason. He was calculating the descent. He had the trader's accounts. He had the guide's information. He had what he could see from above. The first section of the descent only. The mountain's curve blocked the rest. He had the information from the scouts he had sent down 2 hours before dawn on the 1st rest day. The scouts had come back with specific information. The first section of the descent was difficult. The path was steep and in places had been damaged by the autumn. Rockslide on the right side in one section, which would require the men to navigate carefully. The elephants would need handlers in the damaged section. The 4th section of the descent was the section from the trader's accounts. The section where previous armies had lost numbers. The section he had known about since Cartagena and had been unable to address except by knowing it was there. The scouts had seen it. It was worse than the accounts had described. He filed this. He would see it when he arrived at it. He could not solve it from above. He had enough rope for the worst section, probably. He had the engineers. He had the Iberian infantry who had been in difficult terrain before. He had 37 elephants who had crossed the Rhone and survived 9 days of this mountain. They would manage what they managed. He had what he had. He turned from the edge. He will cross these mountains again. 16 years later, going home. Going home with the war lost and Rome behind him. He will cross them as an old man with diminished company and not enough of anything. He will not come to the southern edge of the summit on the day of his arrival. He will not stand and look at Italy in the late autumn light. He is not that man yet. He turns away and gives the orders for the next morning. Move at the 3rd hour before dawn. The cavalry first, then the infantry, then the baggage, then the elephants. The engineers to walk ahead of the main column on the damaged first section. Intervals of 400 feet between sections so that problems do not cascade. He has calculated this. He sleeps. On the morning of the 3rd day at the summit, the order came. It did not come with ceremony. He was in his position at the front of the column before the camp was fully awake. The officers were at their positions. The section leaders were at their sections. He said, "Move." The column moved. Down. The first section of the descent was the steepest. The path turned south, then southwest. The ground dropped away under the feet, in a different way from the ground of the ascent. The ascent had pushed back. The descent pulled forward. The weight moved to the front of the body. The knees took what the hips could not hold. Below them, Italy. Not visible. They were inside the mountain now. On the descent. Peaks above. Path below. The valley still days away. Italy was down there at the end of the down. They had seen it from above. They had made it real by looking at it. Now they were going toward it. The going toward it was 6 more days of descent. 6 more days of the specific problems of moving downhill on a mountain path. In October, with 50,000 men and animals, he knew some of what the 6 days would contain. Not all. He walked. He counted the things on the left side of the path. The slope on the left fell away more steeply here than it had on the ascent. The gorge was further below. The sound of it was different, quieter from this height, or perhaps the wind was taking the sound another direction. He counted. 1 rock formation where the stone had split vertically from ice pressure. 2 sections where the path was narrower than the main body of the path. 1 small flat area, perhaps the size of a tent, wide enough for 6 men to stand. 1 place where the path turned and for 3 paces had a view back up toward the summit. He took those 3 paces and looked back. The summit was already above the cloud that had formed since the column started moving. The flat space at the top was not visible. The peaks around it were visible, cold and permanent and indifferent. He took 1 more look. He turned back to the path. The column was moving. Italy was at the end of the column's direction. He was facing the same direction as the column. He walked. The 5th day of the descent. Not the 5th day since the summit. The 5th day since the army began to go down. The body had relearned the vocabulary of descent. Going up, the weight falls back into the hips. The legs push. The body leans into the slope and works. After 9 days of this, the body expects nothing else. Going down, the weight moves forward. The legs catch it. The knees take what the hips cannot hold. The descent is harder on the knees than the ascent is. The knees do not announce this immediately. They announce it on the 3rd day, when the accumulation becomes audible. The men who had been loudest about the ascent were quietest about the descent. This is the specific humility of mountain crossing. Each direction produces its own complaint. You do not know the complaint of the descent until you are in the descent. By then the ascent is behind you. This complaint is already resolved. He walked. He had been counting the things on the left side of the path. 9 days on the ascent. Now 5 days on the descent. The count was in the thousands. He did not tally the count. The counting was not for tallying. The counting was for the part of the mind that needed to be occupied. The descent had been harder than the ascent. in the ways the accounts described, and in ways the accounts had not described. The ways the accounts described: steeper, colder on the descent side, which faced north and received the shadow earlier and kept it longer. More damaged by the autumn. Sections of path that had been reliable in summer were not reliable now. The ways the accounts had not described. The exhaustion of men and animals who had spent 9 days going up. The ascent had taken something from the army. The descent required something from an army that had already spent its ascent. The margin between what was required and what was available had been narrowing since the 3rd day of descent. Not past critical. Still viable. The word viable was doing work it had not done at the beginning. When the word was not necessary. When the margin was not in question. The word viable was now necessary. He had the engineers working the damaged sections ahead of the main column. 2 hours ahead. They walked the path, identified the worst sections, and prepared them as well as what they had allowed. Stakes. The rope he had left. Handholds where the rock was solid enough. He had lost 40 feet of rope on the ascent. He had noted this and had kept the note. He had other rope. Enough, probably. The engineer's reports had not yet required more than he had. They had required close to what he had. Probably and close to were the vocabulary of a margin under pressure. He kept walking. The summit was above the clouds now. He could not see it. He had seen it once, looking back on the morning of the 2nd descent day. After that, cloud. The mountain keeping the summit to itself. The army was not on the summit anymore. The army was in the descent, and the descent would not be resolved by looking back at the summit. He did not look back again. Below them, Italy remained where it had been from the summit. He could not see it now. The descent side ran through a narrower valley. Walls on both sides. The view of the plain was blocked. Italy was below the valley, below what the valley walls showed. It was still there. He was still going toward it. The elephants had been the descent's specific problem. Going up, the elephants leaned back and pushed forward with their full weight. This was what they were built for. Going down, their weight wanted to run ahead of their feet. They did not understand this, and they did not like it. Their feet were careful. Their complaints were not. The handlers had been managing this for 5 days, and their management showed in their faces. He had stopped to speak to one handler at the end of the 3rd descent day. The handler was one of the men who had been with the elephants since Cartagena. Since before Cartagena, working in the breeding grounds east of the city where the animals came from. He had been managing his specific elephant for 4 years. He said, "How is she?" The handler said, "She is tired." He said, "And you?" The handler said nothing. He said, "1 more day like this and then the angle eases." The trader's accounts are clear about the angle. The handler nodded. He did not look relieved. He looked like a man who has been told 1 more day, calculating what 1 more day costs. He understood this calculation. He had been making the same calculation on behalf of the whole army for 14 days. He left the handler and returned to his position. He did not know whether the trader's accounts were correct about the angle easing. He had said what would be useful. Whether it was accurate depended on accounts that had already proven approximately reliable and occasionally wrong. He would know the next day. The next day the angle eased, approximately as the accounts described. The handler's elephant moved better at the easier angle. The handler did not look at him when the angle changed. He was busy with the elephant. He noted this and moved on. On the 6th day of the descent, the first sign of the valley below. Not the valley itself. The first sign. The smell of it. An army that has been in rock and ice and altitude for 15 days does not smell new things. The body becomes accustomed. The accustomed becomes background. The new arrives as a disturbance of the background. The disturbance was wet earth. the specific smell of soil that holds water, that grows things, that is not rock and is not ice and is not the cold clean nothing of high altitude. The men near the front of the column stopped talking and raised their heads. Not all of them, the ones who noticed first, then the ones beside those. The head-raising moved back through the column, the same way the stopping had moved when they reached the summit. Slower, more uncertain. A stop is definitive. A smell is not. But the smell was there. He had smelled it 400 paces before the first man raised his head. He had been expecting it at approximately this distance, based on the trader's accounts, on his own experience of how valleys announce themselves to men coming down from altitude. He had expected it, and when it arrived he noted it and did not stop. One more day, perhaps two. He kept walking. For what vinegar does to hot stone. The sixth morning began well. The path was wider than the day before. The ice was less. The angle of descent had softened overnight. Or it seemed that way. Not the same thing, but felt like it. The Numidian cavalry, who had been walking their horses since the third day, began to ride in short sections. The horses were not happy. They were moving. The column had found a rhythm. This is the second danger of the mountain. The first is the worst sections. The second is the moment after, when the body decides the worst is over and stops paying attention. The gaps between sections widened. Men talked. The Africans walked without wrappings. Hannibal had sent riders back the previous evening with one instruction: maintain intervals. By the 4th hour of the 6th morning, the intervals had loosened. He sent a rider back again. He was thinking about the valley below, which was visible now as a real place, not a suggestion of color. The floor of it, flat and wide and brown in late autumn. The Valley. In it somewhere, the people who had been sending him messages since before the crossing. People who hated Rome. People waiting for someone to come down the mountain and give their hatred a shape it could use. The guide stopped. He was at the front of the column. He stopped in the way a man stops when the path has stopped first. Hannibal came forward from his position. The path had ended. Not a gradual narrowing. Not a difficult section requiring care. The path had ended at a wall of rubble. A portion of the cliff face above had come down at some point in the recent months. The rubble covered the ledge for perhaps 40 paces. It ran from the cliff face on the left to the edge on the right. It was not rubble that could be climbed. It was loose and deep, and the right edge was a very long way down. Hannibal stood at the edge of it. He looked left. Cliff face, vertical, wet from seepage. No way through. He looked right. The edge and the drop below. No way around. He took 4 steps onto the rubble to test it. It moved under him. Not catastrophically. Enough. He stepped back. Behind him, the column was still arriving. The front had stopped. The section behind had not received the information yet. The stop moved backward through the column, slowly and then all at once, the way a stop always does. 26,000 men. The silence of that many men going still is not silence. It is a particular pressure. The absence of moving feet. The absence of the specific breathing of an army in motion. The coughs and the small sounds are still there. But the forward intent is gone. The rhythm is gone. The mountain had stopped the army. The mountain had not stopped the army before. The Allobroges had tried to stop them. The altitude had slowed them. The cold had cost them. But the column had continued moving from the first morning at the Rhone. It had continued through the Pyrenees. It had continued through 8 days of ascent and 5 days of this descent. Now it was still. Hannibal stood at the edge of the rubble for a long time, not looking at the rubble. Looking at the rubble the way he looks at any obstacle, not with frustration, with the kind of attention that is waiting for information. The rubble was an obstacle with specific properties. He was learning the properties. The officers who could see him did not approach. They had learned this at the Rhone and in the mountains. When he stood at the edge of something and looked at it, you waited. He crouched. He picked up a piece of rubble from the top of the pile. It was not the soft stone of river valleys. It was the old hard rock of the high Alps, the kind that has been under pressure since before there were people to walk over it. Hard, dense, heavy for its size. He held it. He turned it in his hand. He set the piece down. He stood. He said, "Bring wood." The nearest officer waited. Hannibal said, "And vinegar. Every amphora we have left." The officer repeated this to himself. He said, "Yes." He had not looked at the officer. The officer went. Polybius records this. He records it briefly, without extensive explanation, because the principle was known to anyone who had worked stone. Fire applied to rock for a sustained period heats the surface. The surface expands. The interior does not expand at the same rate. Then cold liquid hits the hot surface. The sudden contraction opens the stone along lines it was already considering. The stone does not break dramatically, persuades itself to break. Along the fault lines the heat has found. This requires heat first. Sustained heat. The rock of the high Alps takes time to absorb it. The fire must be maintained for a day, sometimes two, before the stone is ready for the liquid. Hannibal knew this. He knew it from the accounts of miners in the silver regions south of Cartagena. He had read the accounts, noted the principle, stored it with the other principles that might be useful. He had not known in Cartagena that he would need this. Fire and vinegar on a mountain path in October. He had not known he would not need it. He stored what was useful. The wood came forward in loads. The army had been rationing wood since the third day of the descent. He was using what they had rationed. Men set the wood at the base of the largest rocks, the ones blocking the center of the path. Small fires first, then larger. The rock took time. Hannibal sat beside one of the fires. He does not sit by fires on the march. He walks or stands or looks at the path. He does not sit. He sat beside this fire, close enough that the heat reached his hands and face. He did not warm his hands at it. He sat and he watched the rock and he let the fire do what the fire was doing. The elephant handlers moved their animals back along the path to a section wide enough to turn. The elephants did not understand why they were turning. The handlers gave them no reason because no reason is translatable in these circumstances. They gave the animals contact and motion and the clear instruction of a specific direction. The animals went in the direction. Officers came to him during the first day of waiting. They came one at a time. They asked, quietly, about alternate routes. He heard them out. He said, "There are none." They asked, "How do you know?" He said, "I looked last night." He had looked. From the edge of the camp in the dark, he had examined the cliff face in both directions. The cliff was vertical and wet on both sides of the rubble. No route that an army could take. He was certain. He had been certain at the time, and he remained certain in the daylight. The officers went back to their sections. On the second morning, one officer came to him alone. He asked, "What happens if the rock does not break?" Hannibal said, "Go back to your men." The officer went. He said this not because the question was unreasonable. It was a reasonable question. He said it because the answer was not available. If the rock did not break, he would find another answer. He did not know what the other answer was. The fire had been burning for a day and a half. The rock was receiving the heat. The quarryman said the cracks were developing as expected. He had no reason yet to need a different answer. Until he had a reason to need a different answer, the current answer was sufficient. The army had been stationary for one full day. A stationary army is a different thing from a moving army. A moving army has direction. A stationary army has nothing to do but think. Soldiers think about food first, then about the people they left behind. Then, if the situation is bad enough, about what happens if the situation stays bad. Hannibal had understood this since he was old enough to command. He had the officers move through the sections at midday, not with orders, with presence. An officer who moves through a stopped column without speaking does more than one who speaks. His presence says, "This is expected. This is within the plan." He walked the sections himself in the afternoon. He walked at his normal pace. He did not look at the rock. He looked at the men. He looked at what they were doing. He looked at what the stopping was doing to them. The Iberian infantry were sharpening weapons. They had been doing this since the Pyrenees at every long stop. It was their response to enforced stillness. A weapon being sharpened is a weapon getting more useful. The uselessness of standing still is partially addressed by making something useful. The Iberians had found this equation early and were applying it. The Numidian cavalry were with their horses. This was never an optional activity. A Numidian without his horse is not whole. The horses were checked and watered and groomed with whatever was at hand. The Numidians found water in the snowmelt from the rocks above. They brought it to the horses in whatever containers were available. The horses drank. The Numidians watched them drink. With the attention of men for whom a healthy horse is the foundation of everything else. The African infantry sat and talked. Not about the rock. Not about the vinegar or the fire or what happened if neither worked. About Carthage. About the coast. About specific women. Specific food. The quality of heat that a city on the African sea holds in August. Hannibal heard fragments of this as he walked the sections. He did not stop it. Men who talk about where they came from have not yet decided they are not going back. This was useful. He spent the second day the same way he spent the first. Sitting by the fire in the morning. Walking the sections in the afternoon. At the fire again in the evening. Watching the rock. The fires were maintained continuously. Men tended them in shifts of 2 hours. 2 men on, 2 off. The 2 hours was the limit for sustained attention beside a fire in cold air. After 2 hours, the fire becomes the thing you sleep at rather than the thing you watch. He had calculated this and set the shift length accordingly. The face of the rock changed slowly. Darker where the heat was most concentrated. The surface taking on a specific quality that the quarryman called receptive. The quarryman had not been asked for opinions. He offered them anyway, briefly and without elaboration, to the officer who relayed them to Hannibal. Hannibal listened. He made one adjustment. He said, "Wait 1 more hour before the second application." The quarryman, when he heard this, was silent for a moment. He was told again, the general says. He nodded. The quarryman's silence was the silence of a man whose professional judgment had been overruled. He might be right. The additional hour might cost nothing and gain nothing. The general might simply be wrong about the optimal timing. He was not wrong. By the end of the additional hour, the rock had visibly changed. The hairline cracks that had been forming since the previous day had opened slightly. The surface color was more uniform. The stone had reached the temperature the additional hour was for. The quarryman saw this and said nothing. He had said nothing about being right, and he said nothing about being wrong. He was a quarryman. He worked stone. He had told the officer his professional assessment. The general had modified it. The modification had been correct. He kept this information. He did not offer it. What the soldiers did during the 2 days of waiting was as individual as the soldiers themselves. The Iberian infantry sharpened weapons. They did this at every long stop on the march. Not because the weapons needed sharpening, Because sharpening gives the hands work when the body is stopped. A sharp weapon is a useful weapon. A man who is sharpening a weapon is not thinking about whether the weapon will be needed. He is thinking about the edge. The Gallic recruits who had joined at the Rhone sat together and talked. They talked in the way of men who have been part of something they did not expect to survive. Not about surviving it. About the parts they could not have predicted. The cold of the summit. The specific weight of a pack after 7 days. The way elephants sound when they are unhappy at altitude. They talked about these things. The way men talk about events when the events are finished and the talking is the processing. The engineers worked. They always worked. The stop for the rock work was not, from the engineer's perspective, a stop. It was a task. The task was fire management, crack monitoring, organization of the clearing operation for when the clearing became possible. This work had a specific sequence. The sequence was executing. The engineers were in the sequence. The Numidian cavalry had an additional problem during the stop. A stationary cavalry force in a mountain defile is a cavalry force deprived of what it does. Numidian cavalry is designed for movement. Long movements and short movements and sudden movements and sustained movements. It is designed for the negotiation between a horse and ground at speed. The stop deprived them of all of this. They managed their horses instead. They groomed them. They checked legs and hooves. They found water in the snow above the path and brought it to the horses in whatever could hold water. They spent time with the horses in the specific Numidian way. Not doing anything in particular. Present. Together. The relationship maintenance that requires no agenda. This was not wasted time. A horse still for 2 days needs those 2 days of management. Before it is asked to move through cleared rock on a descent. The management done during the wait paid for the performance at the crossing. He walked through the Numidian section during the afternoon of the second day. He noticed one thing. The horses were calm. He walked on. The 2 days had a rhythm to them that was different from the rhythm of movement. Moving through a mountain has the rhythm of constant small decision-making. Stop changed this. Stop had its own rhythm. The rhythm of the fires needing to be fed. The rhythm of the watches. The rhythm of the quarryman's morning assessment and the relay of what he had found. On the second evening, a Gallic soldier from the eastern foothills came to the officer who managed the Gallic recruits. He said, his uncle had told him about this section of the path. The uncle had crossed this pass twice. The first time there had been no rubble here. The second time there had been rubble. The uncle had turned back. The officer brought this to Hannibal. Hannibal heard it. He said, "When was the second crossing?" The officer found the soldier and asked. The soldier said, 4 years ago. His uncle was not certain of the exact year. Hannibal said, "Thank him." He noted that the rubble had been present for at least 4 years. This changed nothing about the current situation. Changed one thing about his information. He now knew that the rubble was not a new fall. It was a fall that had been present for at least 4 years. This meant it had settled. Settled rubble clears differently from fresh rubble. More compacted at the base. Less prone to secondary collapse during clearing. He had cleared it as if it were settled rubble, based on the general age of the stone's fracture patterns. He had been correct. He noted this and filed it. Not with satisfaction. With accuracy. The fires burned through the second night. The rock continued to heat. He sat beside the largest fire for most of the evening. He did what he always did when fires were working on something. He let the fire work. He did not think about what the fire was doing. He thought about what came after the fire. After the fire, the path cleared. The cavalry across. The infantry across. The elephants across in sequence. The march to the valley. the Insabra's messenger at the foot of the mountain, the Ticinus, for days beyond. He had planned each of these steps in Cartagena. He had refined the planning at the Rhone. He had been carrying the planning across the Pyrenees and the Alps, through 9 days of ascent and 6 days of descent. The fire was the current step. The fire was executing. The rest waited. He sat. By the second day of the rock work, the army had organized itself around the waiting. Not because someone had told it to, because armies are self-organizing in the presence of sustained obstacles. The obstacle imposed a structure. The structure was the engineers' work at the front. Everyone else occupies the time usefully. The useful occupations were the ones each section had developed independently during the previous long stops on the crossing. The Iberian infantry had sharpened their weapons beyond what any near-term engagement would require. They sharpened them anyway. They had been sharpening them since the Pyrenees. This was their particular response to enforced stillness. Useful in one sense, excessive in another. They were aware of both and continued anyway. One Iberian soldier was watching the fires from the second rest section when the senior engineer walked past. The soldier said, "How long?" The engineer stopped. He looked at the fires. He looked at the rock. He said, "Tomorrow morning, if the night goes well." The soldier said, "The night will go well." The engineer said, "Yes." Then the engineer went back to the rock face and the soldier went back to his weapon. This conversation was notable for what it was not. It was not a conversation about whether the rock would break. A man who says the night will go well is not predicting the night. He is stating what the night is going to be, because the alternative is not available. The night will go well because there is no other option that either of them is willing to name. The engineer went back to the rock face knowing that the soldier's statement was not an expression of confidence. It was an expression of commitment. A man who has committed to continuing does not spend time on alternatives. The engineers had this in common with the rest of the column. They had all committed. The commitment had been made at different times for different men. For some of them at the Ebro, for others at the Pyrenees, for the Gallic recruits at the Rhone. For the engineers, the commitment was renewed at each obstacle. The Rhone had been an obstacle. The mountain had been an obstacle. This rock face was an obstacle. The engineer had renewed the commitment at each one. He went back to the fire and tended it. On the morning of the third day, the vinegar came forward. Hannibal was at the rock when it arrived. He had been there since before the fires were fed. He said, "Pour." The cold vinegar hit the hot stone. The sound, first a hiss. The hiss of very cold liquid on very hot rock. Then, beneath the hiss, a different sound. Smaller, more internal. The sound of the rock receiving what the heat had prepared it for. Not cracking. Something before cracking. The sound of the stone making a decision. The rock did not break. Not yet. He said, "Wait. 20 minutes. He said, "Again." The second application landed on the same surface as the first. The surface was still hot. The vinegar from the first application had not yet finished its work. The second application added to it. The sound this time was shorter and deeper. Less hiss. The sound from inside the stone was larger. A piece of rock the size of a man's chest came away from the upper left of the largest block. Not dramatically. It simply separated from where it had been and fell forward onto the rubble pile. Then 2 smaller pieces from the right side. Then a series of sounds from inside the block, brief and sequential, like the stone counting something. Then a long silence. Then the block shifted. It did not fall. It shifted, moved slightly from where it had been. The way very large things move when the force holding them in place has been removed. A subtle movement, the kind that, if you were watching from far away, you might not notice. The quarryman, who was watching from 10 paces, noticed. He sat down on the path. The men who had been watching the fires for 2 days heard the sound. They did not cheer. They were too tired to cheer. Some of them stopped what they were doing and looked at the rock. Some of them looked at each other. Some of them looked at Hannibal. Hannibal was looking at the rock. He said, "Clear it." Men with iron tools came forward. The rubble was moved to the edge and over it, piece by piece. This took most of the morning. Not clean. Not a road. Manageable. He thought about what committed men built. He had been thinking about this since the Ebro. The Ebro was the last point where the campaign could have been abandoned without full commitment. Before the Ebro, it was a campaign. After the Ebro, it was the thing the campaign was pointing toward. The crossing. The Alps. Italy. The commitment had been made by crossing the Ebro. Everything since had been the execution of what was committed to. A man who has committed cannot afford to think about commitment. He can think about what the commitment requires. He can think about what executing it costs. The rock, the fire, the vinegar, the path on the other side of the rock. By midday there was a path, narrow, uneven, the kind of path that requires attention and care, and the specific patience of men who have been patient for 2.5 days, and found at the end a way through. The cavalry went first. The horses did not like the new surface. They went. The infantry followed. Then the elephants. Chapter 5. The ground is flat here. The 6th day of descent ended at the valley floor. The last slope was the gentlest. The path widened as it descended, the mountain releasing its grip. The way a grip held too long releases slowly, because it has forgotten how to release and must remember it. The first man to reach flat ground was a cavalry soldier from Spain. He had ridden near the front of the column for the entire descent. He did not know he was first. He stepped onto flat ground and stopped. He was not the kind of man who stopped unnecessarily. His feet had stopped for him. The horse stopped when the rider stopped. The rider sat on the stopped horse on flat ground and did not move. The men behind him stopped too, not because he had stopped, because their feet had made the same decision, independently, at the same moment, a decision that was not made with the mind. The body knows when the thing it has been inside has ended. The elephants stopped. They lowered their heads. Their trunks went down and moved slowly along the flat ground, taking in what the stone had not offered for 14 days. Wet earth, frost over grass, the smell of a place that grows things, the smell of soil that holds water, the smell of something organic rather than mineral, the smell of the valley that the army had been descending toward since the summit. The elephants processed this for a long time. The handlers stood beside them and did not rush them. The handlers understood. After 14 days on stone, they knew what flat grass smelled like to an animal deprived of it. They gave the animals the time. The animals were owed the time. The African soldiers stood with their faces toward the thin winter sun. Not warm. It was November in the Pa Valley and the wind still came off the peaks above. But the sun was directional. It came from somewhere other than directly overhead. It reached faces at an angle that a face could receive. One soldier near the front of the African section began to laugh. Not loudly, almost to himself. The man beside him looked at him. Then the second man made a sound that was in the same direction as the first. The Iberian infantry dropped to one knee. Some were pressing their hands flat against the earth. This is what soldiers do when they return to ground that is not stone. The ground that is not stone has different information in it. The flat of the hand against flat earth is not a gesture with a name. It is something the body does without being told. Hannibal came through the stopped men to the front. He stood on flat ground. He did not look at the mountains. He looked at the army. He counted. He counts people the way some men count money. Not because he enjoys it, because he needs the exact number to know what is possible. He counted by section, eyes moving left to right across the stopped column, multiplying and adding. Under 1 minute, his count matched the officers' list. 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, 37 elephants. He had brought 20,000 infantry across the Alps. He had planned to bring more. He had arrived with 20,000. 20,000 was the number. The calculation would continue from 20,000. He looked at the army, 14 days of mountain behind them, standing in the winter sun on the first flat ground since the foothills south of the Rhone. Cold, thinner than they had been in September. Missing people who had been standing in their sections 6 months ago and who were not standing there now. Present, moving, capable. He said nothing. The Insabra's messenger appeared. He had been waiting at the base of the mountain path. 3 days. Someone in the valley had seen the army on the mountain and had sent word ahead. The messenger had rehearsed the moment. He came to Hannibal with the look of a man who has been carrying something important, ready to put it down. His message: the Roman army is at the Ticinus River. The general commanding is Publius Cornelius Scipio. He has come from the coast. He has cavalry and infantry. He is positioned at the Ticinus, 4 days north of this position. Hannibal heard this. He said, "How many cavalry?" He was told. He said, "How many infantry?" He was told. He nodded. The messenger waited for more questions. None came. The messenger asked, "What do you need from us?" Hannibal said, "Grain, for days of it, and a guide to the river." The messenger said he would send word. He left. Hannibal turned back to the army. The army was still standing in the sun. The Numidians were managing their horses, which had smelled the grass and wanted to move toward it. The Iberians had dropped to one knee. Some were pressing their hands flat against the earth. No command had been given to stop. No command was needed. "Make camp," he said. He walked to where his tent would be. He does not look back at things he has left behind. The Ebro, the Pyrenees, the Rhone. He crossed each of them and did not turn. He crossed the Alps and he does not turn now. He has left looking back to the men who are better at it than he is. The camp took shape in the late afternoon. The sounds of an army making itself horizontal after 14 days of vertical. Tent poles driven into actual earth. Wood gathered from the valley floor, which has trees and not only rock. The smell of dry wood burning. A different smell from wet mountain wood. The smell of a fire that is warm rather than necessary. The officers came to him one at a time as the camp was established. The cavalry captain reported on the horses. Most had recovered on the descent. 3 with serious leg problems had not improved. He recommended 2 days of rest before moving. Hannibal said 1 day. The captain said, with respect, 2 days would be better for the horses. Hannibal said 1 day. We move at half speed on the 2nd day. The horses will manage. The captain went. The infantry officers reported by section. The African infantry. Fever cases stable, not increasing. 2 men still walking with help. The Spanish infantry. No significant losses in the final descent. The Numidian cavalry. Horses generally healthy. Men short on food. All of this was expected. The supply margin he had built in Cartagena was a 14-day crossing with 12 days of supplies. He had arrived in 14 days. The 2-day deficit was within what the Gallic allies were expected to provide. The messenger had confirmed grain. For days of it. He would move in 1 day. That night, the fires burned high and orange. The African soldiers sat close. They did not talk much. The warmth was enough. 14 nights beside a fire. in cold that has not relented. Tonight the fire is the same fire, but the ground is flat and the mountain is behind. The warmth is different tonight. It is its own thing. He will come back this way, not through the Alps. He will not cross the Alps again for many years, but he will come back to this valley. He will be in the Po Valley for 2 winters before he goes south. The valley will know him by then. The people of the valley will have chosen, by that point, which side of the calculation they are on. Most of them will have chosen his side. The calculation will have been clear to them by then. He will come back to this valley and it will be different from what it is tonight. Tonight it is just the valley and the army and the first flat ground in 14 days. The valley camp was different from every camp since the Pyrenees. Not because it was more comfortable. It was not significantly more comfortable. The weather in the Po Valley in November was cold. Cold with wind and moisture. Cold that settled into the ground at night and did not lift until late morning. The tents were the same tents. The food was what the Insabra's messenger had promised to send, which had not yet arrived. The fires were the same fires. What was different? The ground beneath the fires was flat. This is not a small difference when the preceding ground has been stone and slope for 14 days. Flat ground means that the tent stakes go in at the correct angle. The fires burn evenly. The sleeping arrangements lie flat against a flat surface. The body has been managing the exhaustion of uneven ground for 2 weeks. Tonight it does not have to manage that. The body is doing other things tonight. It is remembering flat ground. The way the weight settles differently. The way the hips release from the bracing position they have held since the Pyrenees. The specific process of muscles letting go. Of a tension so habitual the muscles had forgotten they were holding it. He sat at the edge of the camp and felt this. Not with sentiment. He felt it the way an engineer feels a structural change. Accurately, without interpretation. His hip flexors were releasing. He had been aware of the tension in them since the 3rd day of the ascent. He had been managing it the way he managed everything inside the normal range of physical function. By noting it, by continuing, by not allowing the noting to cost other attention. Now the tension was releasing on its own because the flat ground was releasing it. He sat with this for a few minutes. The Insabra's grain arrived 2 hours after the camp was established. The messenger had been efficient. The grain came on 4 donkeys, with a Gallic escort of 6 men who looked at the army with the look of men revising their understanding. They had heard what had crossed the mountain. Now they were seeing it. He received the grain without ceremony. He received the escort without ceremony. He thanked them and sent them back with a message for the Insabra's headman. The message was 4 words in the Gallic dialect the translator had taught him on the march. He had practiced the words for 3 days before the crossing ended, because the practice was a calculation. He had estimated the message would be in the top 10 most important communications of the winter. He wanted to deliver it in the headman's language. The 4 words said, "We have arrived. Next spring, Rome." He did not know if the grammar was exactly right. He knew the words were right. The escort heard him say the words. They looked at each other. Then they looked at the army. Then they went back to the settlement. He went to his tent. He reviewed what he knew about the Ticinus. The river was narrow, fordable in multiple places. The Roman cavalry that Scipio had brought was good cavalry. Not as mobile as the Numidians. Good. A general who manages good cavalry on a fordable river is working with specific options. He had thought through the options Scipio had available. Scipio was a capable man. He would use the river correctly. The river was what Hannibal had, not the Roman cavalry. What he had was the Numidians. The Numidians did not fight like Roman cavalry. They did not fight like any cavalry the Romans had encountered in sufficient numbers. He had 6,000 of them. Scipio had thought about the Numidians. He had reports from Spain. He had accounts from the Punic Wars. He thought he knew what Numidian cavalry did. He knew the general shape. He did not know the specific application Hannibal had designed. He would know it in 4 days. He set down the plans. He needed to sleep. He had not slept more than 4 hours at any one time since the Rhone. The crossing had imposed its own schedule, and the crossing schedule was not generous. Now he was on Italian soil. The Italian soil did not require the same schedule. He would still sleep 4 hours. The Ticinus was 4 days away. There was no urgency in sleeping longer. The 4 hours were sufficient, and the schedule he had maintained was one he could continue. He lay down. He counted backward from 1,000. At 800 and something, a sound from the camp. Not alarming. The specific sound of a camp that is settling for the night. Men finding their arrangements. Animals finding theirs. The particular sequence of sounds that marks the hour when a camp decides it is done with the day. He listened to it. He does this in the evenings before he sleeps. He listens to the camp settle. Not for information. The settling sounds contain no information he needs. He listens because the camp settling is what a functioning army sounds like at the end of a day. He has been listening to it since he was 9 years old in his father's camp in Africa. The sound was the same in Africa, in Spain, on the Rhone, in the Alps, here in the Pa Valley on the first night on Italian soil. The camp was settling. He was asleep before 800. The first full day in the valley was a rest day. He had planned for 1 rest day before moving toward the Ticinus. The crossing had taken 14 days. The army had been moving, with small interruptions, since the Ebro. The rest day was not generosity. It was maintenance. An army that is rested fights differently from an army that is not. The difference appears in the second hour of an engagement. In the first hour, the adrenaline of engagement masks the fatigue. In the second hour, the fatigue reasserts itself against the adrenaline. An army that is rested in the second hour maintains what the first hour established. An army that is not rested begins to give back what the first hour gained. The Ticinus would require the second hour. The officers went through the sections in the morning. They were looking at the same things he had been looking at since the Pyrenees. Feet, faces, the specific indicators of men who were approaching their functional limit. Men at the limit needed different decisions from men with margin. He had more men at the limit than he had expected. Not many more. Within the outer margin. He noted this. He had 1 rest day built into the calculation before the Ticinus. 1 rest day was what the calculation offered. He gave the men 1 rest day. In the afternoon, the Gallic recruits who had joined at the Rhone went to the nearest Insubris settlement. They went without orders. They had family in the area. The settlement was an hour's walk. He had not forbidden it. The Gallic recruits going to the Insubris settlement was exactly what he wanted. They would tell the settlement what they had seen, what crossing the Alps with this army looked like from inside. The settlement would tell the next settlement. He had not given an order encouraging it either. He had simply not forbidden it. They came back in the evening with food from the settlement. More than they had asked for by the look of it. The settlement had given more than requested. This was information. The settlement had decided something. What it had decided was visible in the amount of food. He noted this. He ate with his officers that evening for the first time since before the crossing. Not a formal meal. The camp did not have the facilities for a formal meal, and he had no interest in one. He ate in the same place at the same time as his officers. A different thing from eating alone. He answered questions during the meal. Not about the Ticinus. About the crossing. The officers had questions about the crossing. questions they had not asked during the crossing. Asking would have cost attention the crossing was using. Now the crossing was done. The questions came. He answered them accurately and briefly. What the traders' accounts had gotten right. What they had gotten wrong. What the Allobroges had done that he had not planned for and what he had done in response. Why he had positioned the Numidians at the Rhone the way he had. He answered for 30 minutes. Then he said, "Tomorrow we move. Rest tonight." He went to his tent. The second morning in the valley. He woke at the usual time. Before the camp did. He dressed. He went to look at the horses. The horses had benefited from the rest day more than he had calculated. The three with serious leg problems had not significantly improved, but the others had. The evening's grass, whatever the Insabras had brought, and the flat ground. Flat ground is undervalued as a recovery condition for horses that have been on mountain terrain. The body uses energy on uneven ground that it does not use on flat ground. The flat ground's contribution to recovery is in this released expenditure. He noted this. He would not need this information before the Ticinus. He would need it after. After the Ticinus, he would need horses for a campaign that would last at least until spring. The horses that could be recovered by spring depended on the days between now and the next engagement. How much could be recovered in that time? Flat ground helped. 4 days to the Ticinus helped. The Gallic grain helped. He noted all of this. He went back to his tent and ate what the camp had available for the morning meal. Since the Pyrenees, every morning meal had been constrained by weight and portability. This morning was different. The crossing had required food that could be carried. Food that could be carried is a specific category of food. Compact, dense, not particularly good. The valley offered a different category. The Insabras grain made bread. The bread was warm when it arrived from the settlement's fire. He ate the bread. He thought about the Ticinus while he ate. Not the tactics. The bridge of supply. What he would need after the Ticinus. Where it would come from. Whether the Insabras could provide it or whether other settlements would be needed. He ate. He thought. He gave the order to move. The first morning in Italy. He stood outside the tent before the formation call. The valley around him was still in the dark. The mountains were behind him. He could not see them. He knew they were there. He had crossed them. The army had crossed them. The calculation in Cartagena had said it was possible. The crossing had confirmed it. He had been in Italy for 2 days now. He had been in Italy for 2 days and Rome did not yet know what was in Italy. The Ticinus was 4 days north. Scipio was at the Ticinus. Rome would know what was in Italy when the Ticinus was done. He waited for the camp to wake. Around the middle of the night, Hannibal left his tent. He walked to the north edge of the camp. The valley stretched ahead in the dark. Flat and wide and cold. The kind of cold that comes when there is nothing to stop the wind. No mountain to take the wind's momentum and redirect it. Just flat ground and the wind moving across it from wherever wind comes from when it has nowhere to stop. He could not see the Ticinus from here. It was 4 days away. Scipio was there, waiting, with cavalry and infantry, with the confidence of a Roman general who has positioned himself on a river and believes the position is sound. The position was sound. Hannibal had the Numidian cavalry, 6,000. He had them for one reason in particular. Roman cavalry can hold a river crossing. Numidian cavalry can go around it. Scipio was a capable commander. Capable Roman commanders use their cavalry carefully. They do not give their cavalry away early, which meant the Numidians would have to earn the opening. He stood at the north edge of the camp. He let the plan run in his head, not reviewing it. The plan did not need reviewing. Something else. Feeling whether the plan still had the shape it had in Cartagena. before the crossing, when it was a plan and not yet an action. It had the shape. For days. Then the Ticinus. He went back to his tent. Somewhere in the dark, the soldier with the wrapped foot found his section and sat. He took the cloth off slowly. He looked at the foot. He pressed the sole flat against the cold ground. Flat ground, not stone. He wrapped the foot again. He lay down. The Ticinus is 4 days away. He does not know this yet. He knows his foot is wrapped. He knows the ground is flat. He knows he is still here. That is the most useful thing a man can know. He sleeps. The mountains behind him are doing what mountains do. They are there. They have been there longer than armies. They will be there after. The army does not appear in the calculation of the mountains. The army has its own calculation. 4 days to the Ticinus. Writer's note: I do not read the Alps as a triumph. I watch him count what came over with him. 90,000 left Spain. 26,000 reached Italy. He counted them at the valley floor. He counted slowly. He did not perform the counting. He just counted. I watch what his face does when the number is done. There is no ceremony between those two things. The numbers are the numbers. The continuing is the continuing. He has built the margin. The margin held, barely. Now there is a valley and a river and Rome. He walks toward it. Next time, the Ticinus. The river is narrow. The Roman cavalry is on the other side. Scipio's son is watching.